The state of the Ukraine Army. The Armed Forces of Ukraine, most commonly known in Ukraine as ZSU or anglicized as AFU, are the military forces of Ukraine. All military and security forces, including the armed forces, are under the command of the President of Ukraine and subject to oversight by a permanent Verkhovna Rada parliamentary commission. They trace their lineage to 1917, while the modern armed forces were formed after Ukrainian independence in 1991. Ukraine's armed forces are composed of the Ukrainian Ground Forces, the Ukrainian Air Force, the Ukrainian Navy, the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces and the Special Operations Forces. Ukraine's Navy includes its own Ukrainian Naval Infantry, as well as Ukrainian Naval Aviation. The Territorial Defense Forces serve as the military reserve force, and in cases of war, it can be mobilized for civilian volunteers to serve in local defense. The Ukrainian Sea Guard is the Coast Guard service of Ukraine, and it is organized as part of the Border Guard Service, not subordinate to the Navy. The Ukrainian Air Defense Forces were a military branch responsible for anti-aircraft warfare from 1991 until it was merged with the Air Force in 2004. Because of the Russian military intervention in Ukraine in 2014, the President commissioned the governors of regions of Ukraine to create volunteer units under the government's territorial defense forces. These units received minimal funding from regional budgets initially and mostly relied on donations. In November 2014, most of the territorial defense battalions were integrated into the Ukrainian ground forces. The National Guard of Ukraine serves as a paramilitary reserve component of the armed forces of Ukraine. Following hostilities with Russia in 2014, Ukraine increased the size of its armed forces to 204,000 soldiers, not counting additional forces, such as border guards, the newly formed National Guard of Ukraine, 60,000, or the Security Service. In 2021, Ukraine's armed forces, now numbering 246,445, was the second largest in the region after the Russian armed forces. Military units of other countries have participated regularly in multinational military exercises with Ukrainian forces in Ukraine. Many of these exercises have been held under the NATO Cooperation Program Partnership for Peace. History. See also: Ukrainian People's Army. The formation of the National Armed Forces in the modern sense dates back to the beginning of the 20th century and coincides with the formation of the modern Ukrainian nation. In official history, this period is referred to as the Ukrainian War of Independence, or the First Liberation Struggle. This process coincided with the end of the First World War and the subsequent collapse of the great European empires that had been formed during the previous centuries. The forerunner of this process was the formation of national military formations in the Imperial and Royal Armies of Austria-Hungary, namely the Legion of Ukrainian Sich Riflemen, based on the formation of which were Ukrainian paramilitary organizations in Galicia, Sich Sports and Fire Brigade, and the National Scout Organization. After the upheavals of the World War I and on the verge of the collapse of empires, the Ukrainians made another attempt to restore statehood. As part of the growing disintegration in the ranks of the Russian Imperial Army, the process of forming national units began. After the Bolshevik coup, this process immediately resulted in a hybrid, clarification needed, war with the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic and the White Guard. Already during the undeclared war, the Army of the Ukrainian People's Republic was formed, but its formation was interrupted by the German administration. It continued in a limited form after the establishment of Hetman of Ukraine Pavlo Skoropadsky's Ukrainian state, known as the Second Hetmanate. During the time of the Hetmanate, the development of the national armed forces was continued. The armed forces of the Ukrainian state were developed with a more systematic approach than in previous attempts. Although previous developments were used in this process, but many mistakes were also made. This eventually resulted in uprisings against the Hetmanate rule, and the reorientation of the Central Powers, which lost World War I against the Entente, which in turn supported the White Guard movement and the Russian Empire as its original ally. Simultaneously with these events, after the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917, numerous military formations were formed on Ukrainian lands, including detachments of the Free Cossacks, Father Makhno's Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and the Bolshevik Red Cossacks. The latter became the basis of the puppet armed forces of the Ukresser, and after the occupation of the Ukrainian People's Republic were included in the Red Army. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, the Ukrainian Galician Army came to the defense of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, based on the formation of the Ukrainian Sich Riflemen of the former Austro-Hungarian Army. During World War II, Ukrainians tried to regain independence and organized armed units and formations, including the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. But all of them were destroyed by Soviet authorities within a few years after the war, and Ukrainians were again forced to serve in the Soviet Army. Origins of the post-1992 Ukrainian Armed Forces. By 1992, the Ukrainian Armed Forces had been completely inherited from the Soviet Union, in which Ukraine had been a member state. Like other Soviet republics, it did not possess its own separate military command, as all military formations were uniformly subordinated to the central command of the armed forces of the USSR. Administratively, the Ukrainian SSR was divided into 3 Soviet military districts. 3 Soviet air commands and most of the Black Sea Fleet naval bases were located on the coast of Ukraine. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent state of Ukraine inherited one of the most powerful force groupings in Europe. According to an associate of the Conflict Studies Research Center, James Scher, this grouping, its inventory of equipment and its officer corps was designed for one purpose: to wage combined arms, coalition, offensive warfare against NATO on an external front. Altogether, the armed forces of Ukraine included about 780,000 personnel, 6,500 tanks, citation needed, about 7,000 combat armored vehicles, 1,500 combat aircraft, and more than 350 ships. Along with their equipment and personnel, Ukraine's armed forces inherited the battle honors and lineage of the Soviet forces stationed in Ukraine. However, due to the deterioration of Russian-Ukrainian relations and the continued stigma of being associated with the Soviet Union, in 2015 the President of Ukraine ordered the removal of most of the citations awarded to the Ukrainian units during the Soviet era. In February 1991, a Parliamentary Standing Commission for Questions of Security and Defense was established. On the 24th of August 1991, the Ukrainian Parliament, in adopting the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, also enacted a short resolution about military formations in Ukraine. This took jurisdiction over all formations of the armed forces of the Soviet Union stationed on Ukrainian soil and established one of the key agencies, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. On the 3rd of September 1991, the Ministry of Defense commenced its duties. On the 22nd of October 1991, units and formations of the Soviet armed forces on Ukrainian soil were nationalized. Subsequently, the Supreme Council of Ukraine adopted 2 laws of Ukraine on the 6th of December 1991, and Presidential Decree No. 4, about armed forces of Ukraine, on the 12th of December 1991. The government of Ukraine surrendered any rights of succession to the Soviet strategic deterrence forces that were staged on the territory of Ukraine. Recognizing the complications of a smooth transition and seeking a consensus with other former members of the Soviet Union in dividing up their Soviet military inheritance, Ukraine joined ongoing talks that started in December 1991 regarding a joint military command of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel.